You can support us with the super thanks button below. While the relentless war between Russian and Ukrainian forces on the Eastern Front continues, the Ukrainian forces are trying to make moves to change the course of the war. The high performance of the Ukrainian forces was a great source of morale and enabled the Ukrainian forces to make more forward-looking moves. Ukrainian forces carried out intense attacks on Russian support points throughout the war. The location of these support points could not prevent the Ukrainian forces. An attack carried out the other day also showed us how determined the Ukrainian forces are to take advantage and what kind of Russian military elements they are targeting. Let's take a closer look at these very strategic attacks by the Ukrainian forces and the war strategy of the Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces accelerated their attacks on Russian military elements and facilities supporting the Russian occupation of Ukraine on the territory of the Russian Federation. Russian forces have an undeniable advantage over Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainian forces carry out very strategic attacks so that the Russians cannot use this advantage in an attack that took place the other day. Ukrainian forces inflicted great damage on the air power of the Russian forces. An explosion occurred near the airport in the Russian city of Yeysk. Yeysk Air Base is 560 kilometers away from the Ukrainian southern fronts. There was also an explosion and a fire at a Russian flight school base in the Krasnodar region. Subsequently, an explosion and fire were reported at the oil depot in the Krasnodar to support 680 kilometers from the front. After a very violent explosion at the Yeysk Air Base, a major fire was reported at the training ground. Although the news about the explosion and fire was denied by the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations, it was seen in the images that the fire continued for a long time, and many emergency teams were sent to the region. At the airport in the city of Yeysk, there were Su-34 fighter bombers, the most important weapon of the Russian Air Force. However, the fate of these 6 aircraft is currently unknown. It is very likely that 6 Su-34 fighter bombers were badly damaged and rendered unusable by explosion and fire. For the time being, we can qualify these planes as missing. Yeysk residents shared on social media platforms the evidence of explosions and fires in the ACEC region. Although the explosions were proven by satellite images and civilians in the area, Yeysk Regional Governor Roman Bublik claimed that the fire broke out on a training ground where military exercises were held. Except for Governor Roman Bublik's statement, no official statement has been made yet. However, looking at the photographs, it is obvious that the military fire did not occur as a result of the military exercise. Although the Kremlin government and the Russian army refrained from making a statement on this issue, we can say with peace of mind that the explosion and fire were caused by the unmanned aerial vehicles of the Ukrainian forces. When we look at the geographical location of Yeysk, the Ukrainian forces have the capacity to carry out this attack. The Yeysk region gives Russian forces a significant advantage in the Azov Sea and occupied Mariupol. Yeysk is located 170 kilometers across the Sea of Azov from Mariupol, which is occupied by Russian forces. Yeysk Military Airport is only 300 kilometers from the Bakhmut district, where fierce fighting took place, and the airport has the power to support the invasion operations in Bakhmut, which has become the main focus of the Russian forces. Besides, Yeysk is located only 560 kilometers from the southern front line, which is one of the main focuses of the Ukrainian forces. This makes Yeysk an important target for Ukrainian forces. The region may seem distant when you look at the numbers, however. Ukrainian forces have also carried out drone strikes to more distant points in recent days. A series of incidents and explosions occurred in various spots of Russia that appeared to be related to drone threats. On the same day, many explosions occurred in the depths of Russia due to an unmanned aerial vehicle attack. These attacks are thought to have taken place from surprisingly remote location. Let's take a closer look at the attacks on the military installations deep in Russia, which have become recurring targets for Ukrainian drone attacks. Krasnodar is one of the regions most exposed to drone attacks by Ukrainian forces. Krasnodar is of strategic importance for the Russian invasion plan. At the same time, its proximity to the Crimean and eastern Ukraine fronts and being an important support point for Russian forces made Krasnodar a key target for Ukrainian forces. Very close to the explosion in Yeysk, an explosion and fire broke out at a flight school base located near the city of Krasnodar. As always, the Kremlin government and military declined to comment on the explosion. Russian authorities have yet to confirm whether there were any casualties or equipment damage. As a result of our research, we found that the flight school that was exposed to the explosion was in the city of Adygea, south of Krasnodar. The flight school is almost twice as far as Yeysk Airport. From the points just mentioned, it is located approximately 560 kilometers from the Bakhmut region and 730 kilometers from the Kherson region. Another attack, which was carried out at the same time as the Adygea flight school, was carried out at a distance from other attacks. An explosion and fire broke out at an oil depot in the Krasnodar territory. The biggest feature in targeting this oil depot is that it both supported the Russian forces in the Ukraine invasion plan and was linked to one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's close friends, Igor Sechin. Igor Sechin is also the former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. Returning to the details of the incident, the infrastructure of the oil depot belonging to the Rosneft company was damaged as a result of the drone attack. The exact number of drones that took part in the attack on the oil depot was not disclosed. But judging by the photos of the locals, the attack had extremely serious consequences for the oil storage base. Based on photos taken by local residents, it was determined that the fire that started after the explosion was quite strong. Its consequences could not be eliminated for quite some time, and fire and a huge pillar of smoke could be observed from a distance of several kilometers. Emergency crews who came to the area had difficulty in getting the fire under control. Extinguishing works continued for a long time. The point of the attack is quite far from Bakhmut and Kherson. The fact that the Ukrainian forces are launching drone strikes at such great distances indicates that the Ukrainians are willing to end the war very quickly. The Russian Ministry of Defense made a single statement about all these explosions. The Ministry of Defense noted that the Kiev regime is trying to use UAVs to attack civilian infrastructure targets in the Krasnodar region and the Republic of Adygea by trying to portray targets used as military facilities as civilian facilities. The Russian Defense Ministry wants to distort the event as Ukrainian forces committed war crimes. However, when the targets are examined, it is seen that there are points used as military facilities. Well, what kind of advantage will these attacks give the Ukrainian forces? As we all know, Ukrainian forces are preparing for a multi-pronged counterattack in this process. Ukraine has two goals. The first of these targets is the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula is the point that will ignite the collapse of the Russian Federation. With the return of Crimea to Ukrainian control, the credibility of the Kremlin government will be shaken, and it will be difficult to focus on occupation operations in eastern Ukraine. For this reason, Ukrainian forces have given priority to Crimea. After the Crimea is taken, Donetsk and Luhansk regions will be cleared without losing speed. While the Ukrainian forces are advancing towards this goal, they must also eliminate the advantage Mariupol has given to the Russian forces. Mariupol was largely devastated early in the war, but it's still important to Russia because it's the largest city Russia captured and currently controls in 2022 and is also on a crucial supply route. Ukrainian forces continue their attacks in this direction before launching drone strikes in and around Krasnodar. Ukrainian forces attacked several strategic points in Mariupol. Among the targets exposed to the attacks of the Ukrainian forces are a steel factory used by Russia as a military base, 2 fuel depots, and an arsenal in an airport. Ukrainian forces are advancing very systematically to the great victory. The most difficult part of a war is accepting defeat. The defeated country is forced to make many agreements and reparations. It also suffers a serious loss of face. That's why no country wants to accept defeat in a war. And Putin has never accepted it until now. But things are changing now. One after another, explosions on the bridges used by the Russian army. Interesting developments in Ukraine. The Russian army has been suffering a major defeat in Ukraine for a long time on all fronts of the war. The Russian army is suffering heavy losses. According to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, more than 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of the war. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been hospitalized with injuries. This shows how much the Russian army has been defeated in the war. One of the areas where the Russian army suffered the most losses is the town of Bakhmut. The Russian army was planning to win this war by capturing Kiev. The main roads leading to Kiev pass through the city of Bakhmut. The Russian army had to capture Bakhmut in order to advance to Kiev. Therefore, the fighting in this area was intensified. The Russian army sent its largest battalions to this area. However, the Ukrainian army managed to neutralize most of the Russian troops sent to this region after the Russian army suffered a major defeat in this region. There was a big debate in the country. There was a huge backlash against Russian commanders for the failure of the Russian army in this region. The Wagner group stepped in and sent their mercenaries to Bakhmut, but the Ukrainian army won a great success against them, too. The soldiers of the Wagner group suffered a lot of casualties. The soldiers of the Wagner group had not coordinated with the Russian army before going to the city. This led to even more tension between Wagner and the Kremlin. The success of the Ukrainian army has also led to political crises in Russia. The Russian army sent its best soldiers to Bakhmut. They launched many operations, but the Russian army has not succeeded in any of them. The Russian army lost its best soldiers in this region. Many Russian soldiers were captured. Russia has realized that it can no longer win the war in this region. The Russian army had to retreat from this area to avoid further losses. But this retreat was very risky for the Russian army because the Ukrainian army could follow the Russian army and make a big advance. The Russian army could suddenly lose control over many square kilometers of territory. The Russian army does not dare, and it could do great damage to the reputation of the Russian army. The Russian army was forced to retreat because it had failed to capture a town. This could make the Russian army look very weak. The Russian army does not want to suffer such a huge loss of face. They don't even dare to retreat from the battle. While the Russian commanders were discussing this problem, an interesting solution was proposed. The Russian officer proposed a safe way for the army to withdraw. However, this method will result in the Russian army no longer being able to advance in Ukraine. This method proposed by the Russian officer was accepted after long discussions. The Russian officer wanted the army to withdraw from Bakhmut, but this retreat was not going to be a simple and normal retreat. After retreating, the Russian army was to blow up bridges and viaducts. This was to prevent the Ukrainian army from following the Russian army. The Russian army almost made an escape plan. The Russian army started to implement this plan in some towns and backward. 2 critical bridges were destroyed by the Russian army, one along the Bakhmutka River in northeastern Bakhmut, and the other along the Kremov and Bakhmut route just west of Bakhmut. A Ukrainian soldier spoke to British press about this. The Ukrainian soldier described the moment when Russian missiles destroyed a very critical bridge. He said that a missile attack targeting the pillars of the bridge was all part of an escape strategy. This move of the Russian army surprised the whole world. The Russian army's retreat strategy is being scrutinized. But what the whole world is most curious about is the Ukrainian army's plan of attack. The Ukrainian army is planning to launch a comprehensive operation against Russian targets in Bakhmut. According to information coming from the region, there is a huge movement in the Ukrainian army's ammunition. Raise. The Ukrainian army is withdrawing troops from the western front of Bakhmut to different areas, and this way it aims to surround the Russian army. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in this operation, the Russian army could suffer another defeat. The Ukrainian army is making all preparations to launch an offensive as soon as possible. On the other hand, it is reported that many different units of the Ukrainian army have been assigned for this operation. The Sheikh Mansur battalion of Chechen soldiers serving in the Ukrainian army is expected to launch an offensive from the direction of Soledar. It is also expected that soldiers from the Free Russia Legion will join the fighting in Bakhmut. Many different units will take part in the fighting in this area. The clashes in the city resemble a world war. All countries of the world are waiting for the outcome of the fighting in the city. If the Ukrainian army wins the battles in this region, it will gain a very serious strategic advantage in this war. This will lead to an increase in the support of Western countries for Ukraine. Western countries are increasing their rate after the successes of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian government has been waiting for new military support for a long time. The most important part of the support is military aircraft. NATO countries are expected to send their most advanced military aircraft to the Ukrainian army. Once the Ukrainian army has these fighter jets, it plans to destroy all Russian bases. NATO planes are capable of carrying huge amounts of ammunition. The missiles carried by the planes can even destroy huge structures if the Ukrainian army uses these planes. Russia will have no chance of winning this war. The Ukrainian army is waiting for his planes to be delivered to Ukraine as soon as possible. But NATO members are following the course of the war to make a decision. NATO members are making strategic moves as they send support to Ukraine. These steps are shaping world history. The rapidly deteriorating weather precipitated a shift in a focus on urban fighting. The increased intensity of clashes inside the city allowed Russians to secure more gains and start establishing control over tactically significant positions such as factories and high-rise buildings. However, in order to not allow Russians to reap the benefits of these positions, Ukrainians started using various methods of wiping them out together with the Russians. Last time I told you that Ukrainians and Russians in Bakhmut faced the biggest snowfall of the decade that completely covered the ground and trenches and made the infantry fights impossible. However, urban fights are much less affected by such weather conditions, although during the snowfall, the intensity of attacks did slow down because both parties could not use drones and artillery. The freshest reports suggest that once the sky became clear, the clashes inside the city rapidly resumed in the southern part of the region. The Ukrainian 93rd Mechanized Brigade showed how they continue to destroy enemy forces' concentrations. Since everything is covered in snow, spotting manpower in the streets with thermal cameras became much easier, which works more against Russians as they have to get out of cover and assault Ukrainian positions. After the whole squad entered the house, Ukrainians started shelling it with artillery. Since Russians started applying a lot of pressure from the west in an attempt to reach the stadium, Ukrainians started narrowing down the cauldron. But before withdrawing, Ukrainians also made sure to leave some surprises. It seems like instead of using standard booby traps, Ukrainians are waiting until the Russians enter the house and then manually blow up the whole building. Recent combat footage shows how Ukrainians are operating on the outskirts. They pulled the cord from the house across the street during the withdrawal and then manually detonated the explosives from a distance. But the 93rd Mechanized Brigade loved the biggest surprise for Russians on Mariupol Street. Here, Russians have been fighting for weeks to establish control over the tallest building in the region. When Ukrainians realized that they needed to step back to the other side of the street, they mined the whole building. A recently released for the old footage reveals that the moment Russians assumed this tactically significant positions, Ukrainians completely destroyed it. When it comes to the central part of the region, Russians continue to have the initiative. Today it was reported that they managed to secure the second half of the block near the embankment. With the shrinking control over the river bank, it becomes harder and harder to hold the rest of the positions along the river, which is why it is expected that in the next few days Ukrainians will step back towards the main street. Russians are trying to suppress Ukrainian fire and penetrate the defenses deeper. With the drop in temperatures, doing it became easier because of the more visible contrast on thermal cameras. However, due to the density of high-rise buildings, gaining control over each street takes a lot of manpower. Yes, today, Russian war correspondent Alexander Karchenko said that there is so much death here that Russian forces operating in Bakhmut have become apathetic to the deaths of their comrades. He said that very often soldiers use the line on the ground corpses as markers when giving each other directions. In the northern part of the region, Ukrainians seem to have gained even more ground. As you remember, several weeks ago, Russians penetrated Ukrainian defenses here and gained control over 2 streets. 2 days ago, I told you that Ukrainians recaptured 1 street because the fights reportedly took place near the stadium. And today, Ukrainians blew up the bridge right behind them. Some sources say that Russians were not pushed out and the Ukrainians cut them off from the south, while other sources said that such operation would be too risky to conduct without gaining total control over the last street. Today, Ukrainians also released footage of a precision strike on the occupied territory of the ESM industrial complex. The strike was conducted with the Soviet tactical ballistic missile Tochka-U. It seems like this was not the only strike because in the video one operator said to prepare for the second one. Overall, despite the fact that the weather temporarily made infantry fights impossible in the fields, Ukrainians and Russians still engaged in heavy fights inside the city. As Russians started moving into the areas with big buildings that, unlike small houses on the outskirts, could be used as powerful firing points, storage for ammunition, and in some cases, even equipment, Ukrainians started resorting to more drastic measures, such as blowing up the buildings, bridges, and even hitting Russians with the scarce ballistic missiles. Such measures are very effective and do not allow Russians to secure powerful positions to minimize their losses. What do you think about this? As Daily News Team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the Super Thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.